Good afternoon, everybody. You can all hear me in the back? Perfect. Good afternoon, my name is James Herrera-Brooks, and I serve as the Melanie Trent DeShudder Senior Director of Research and Publications here at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture. And I'm delighted to welcome you again to another lecture in our regular Scholar Series. And of course, a big thank you to everyone for all your support of the museum more broadly. Before we begin today, I just want to acknowledge the very generous support of Comrade Mercer Hall, who has endowed the VMHC Scholar Series. He makes all of this possible for us. Comrade serves as an honorary vice chair of the Board of Trustees of this institution and has been a real champion of our work for decades. We also wish to acknowledge former VMHC President and CEO, Dr. Charles F. Bryan Jr., whom this series also honors. Because we're here to, learn more about the Civil War today, I just want to make you aware of another upcoming program, which is also going to feature the Civil War heavily, and that is going to be towards the end of this month. So if you could mark your calendars for Thursday, 28th of May at 6 p.m., please join us for a program related to our current exhibition that just opened, We the People, which looks at the history of immigration to Virginia over 250 years. And on Thursday, 28th of May, we're going to be welcoming the esteemed Civil War historian Harold Holzer for a talk on Abraham Lincoln and American immigration during the Civil War period. So obviously, so many of those soldiers are foreign-born themselves or the sons of foreign-born immigrants. And in so many different ways, immigrant contributions really shape the unfolding of the American Civil War. So that is certainly a lecture not to miss. Before we move on to today's program, I just want to remind you, please take a moment just to check your mobile phones or any other device that you might have on you that can beep, vibrate, buzz, and if you don't mind switching them to do not disturb or silent, just so that we don't distract our speaker today, that would be very much appreciated. So, in today's lecture, Barbara Franco is going to be sharing her findings from a 10-year project to identify the surgeons who cared for the wounded at the Battle of Gettysburg, which, of course, is the bloodiest battle in American history. A database of more than 1,200 surgeons, both Union and Confederate, a database of more than 1,200 surgeons, both Union and Confederate, is the basis for her new book, Gettysburg Surgeons, Facing a Common Enemy in the Civil War's Deadliest Battle. And of course, this database is going to be a boon to researchers who focus on the American Civil War and specifically that recurrently popular engagement. The study includes not only well-documented and prominent physicians who left written accounts, but also the lesser-known surgeons who were part of a complex system of doctors and caretakers, both during and after the battle. And of course, because we're here in Virginia today at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture, we wouldn't be amiss unless we mentioned that 130 of these surgeons served in Virginia regiments at the battle, and today's talk will delve into some of the details of those as well. So today's speaker, Barbara Franco, is the founding executive director emerita of the Gettysburg Seminary Ridge Museum and Education Center. And as a public historian, curator, and museum director, she has written and consulted about museum practice and historical interpretation for decades. She served as the executive director of the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission, the Historical Society of Washington, D.C., and assistant director for museums at the Minnesota Historical Society. She is, of course, author of Gettysburg Surgeons, Facing a Common Enemy in the Civil War's Deadliest Battle, which forms the basis of today's talk. So please join me in welcoming Barbara Franco.
Thank you for that very kind introduction. I am delighted to be here today to talk about my research on the surgeons who cared for the wounded at the Battle of Gettysburg and afterwards. I probably don't have to remind this audience, as we just heard, that Virginia played an important role in that battle, and in fact, nearly 1/3 of the surgeons in Lee's Army of Northern Virginia served in Virginia regiments. The Gettysburg Surgeons project began in 2013 when I was part of the team that worked on the opening exhibits at the Seminary Ridge Museum. And has anybody been to that museum in Gettysburg? Okay, then you have a little bit of an idea about what I'm talking about. As we pulled together the exhibitions for the floor devoted to the care of the wounded, it soon became clear how little we knew about the surgeons. We seemed to have more information about the nurses and the patients. When I retired, I set out to answer my own question. Who were the surgeons at the Battle of Gettysburg, and what could we learn about them and from them? For any of you who have done historical research, you probably understand that research projects are a lot like stray cats and dogs. More often than not, they choose you and follow you home. For me, a simple question turned into a major research project. And in looking at the history of medicine, I realized that there were different ways to approach this. One is looking at the technology. What did doctors know, and what was the knowledge base that they based their treatment on? Secondly, what was the impact of their work and their technology on the patients? What was the result of their treatments? And third was the doctors themselves as a group, as a profession, as a social history. And that is what I decided to focus on. So now, after 10 years of research, a database of over 1,200 names documents Union, Confederate, volunteer, and contract surgeons, all involved in the care of the wounded at Gettysburg. It serves as the basis of the book that I wrote that attempts to tell their collective story. I would like to share with you some of the things that I learned along the way. Oh, this way. Is it working? Yeah. Why Gettysburg? Well, just by the numbers, the three-day battle was one of the deadliest of the war. Gettysburg is also significant because both armies had fully staffed medical departments by that point and were operating with greater efficiency than they had at the beginning of the war. Many of you have probably heard some of the horror stories about First Manassas, that nobody knew what they were doing. And the medical departments of both armies had a lot of ramp up to do, a lot of things to put into position. But by Gettysburg, they're both operating at pretty much the best that they can do. Every battle, it turns out, has a unique story of the medical care, and Gettysburg is no exception. Approximately 165,000 troops were engaged, with 93,000 Union, 71,000 Confederates. And my database currently includes 664 Union and 456 Confederate surgeons and assistant surgeons who were with the two armies at Gettysburg during the battle. And people are often surprised that there are so many doctors on the battlefield. That's just on the battlefield. That number shifts from time to time as I find additional names or information to confirm or question participation during the battle. For any of you who have done research with primary sources, incomplete records, misspelled names, and mangled accounts can somewhat make certain identification a challenge. And I have benefited from the research of many, many others throughout this project and continue to look for any additional names. I don't find very many, but every once in a while I'll find a reference to someone that I hadn't found before. Why surgeons? 40 years after the battle, Dr. Henry Janes, the U.S. surgeon left in charge of the hospitals at Gettysburg, was asked to talk to his colleagues at the Vermont Medical Society about his Civil War experiences. He addressed the lack of recognition for the medical corps in a brutally honest account that asked, "Why is the profession of killing more generally honored than that of saving life?" Arguing that physicians bravely risk their lives during battles and epidemics, he noted that, quote, "In all the Army reunions which I have attended since the close of the war, I never but once have heard any sentiment expressed that the Army had any medical department. We might still ask, why don't we do more to honor the service of the Medical Corps? There are 1,300 monuments on the battlefield at Gettysburg, honoring almost every aspect of the battle. Individuals, regiments, divisions, corps, states. The few permanent records for U.S. medical personnel are in large part thanks to the efforts of Dr. S. Weir Mitchell, and you can see that bronze plaque there. He was one of the contract surgeons sent to Gettysburg from Philadelphia after the battle. Other signage maintained by local organizations marks the location of Union and Confederate field hospitals, like this one on the right. You might wonder why I felt I needed to identify all the surgeons. Why not just pick a few examples? That might have been the saner way to proceed. But I realized early on that it was important to understand their individual stories in a larger context and be able to accurately portray them as a group. Each surgeon is like a piece of a jigsaw puzzle that gradually brings the whole picture into sharper focus. So I'd like to start by sharing a few of the big picture things I learned from this group of surgeons that surprised me. First was their ages. They were a lot younger than I expected. Despite an overall age span of 40 years, the majority of surgeons and assistant surgeons were mostly in their 20s and 30s. For example, Jonathan Letterman, who was the medical director for the Army of the Potomac, was 39, and Henry Janes, the man left in charge, was 31. If you're doing genealogy research on a Civil War surgeon, on Ancestry, or one of the search engines, I can give you a hint. I learned that 1835 is a good birth date to start with. As you can see from this chart of birth dates, the majority of surgeons of both armies were born between 1830 and 1839. The oldest 60-year-old veterans of the Mexican War, like Thomas Sim, medical director of the U.S. Third Corps, born in 1802, or John Work, Confederate assistant surgeon of the 1st Texas, born in 1804. They're on the oldest side. A few Union assistant and contract surgeons were actually born in 1843 and had just graduated from medical school at the age of 20. James Julius Wynn, surgeon of the 45th Georgia, was the youngest regimental surgeon at Gettysburg, and that's a full surgeon, not assistant surgeon, and the youngest Confederate doctor. Born June 9th, 1842, he graduated from Atlanta Medical College in 1860, was appointed assistant surgeon in October 1862, and passed the examination for surgeon in April 1863, just before Gettysburg, and this is all before his 21st birthday. Frederick Dudley, surgeon of the 14th Connecticut, was 6 months older and probably the youngest Union surgeon at Gettysburg. There we go. Their education. I still encounter people knowledgeable about Civil War history who assume that Civil War surgeons were untrained. I often have people come up to me and say, yeah, but they didn't go to medical school. I mean, they had no training, right? Wrong. Despite the continuing belief the Civil War surgeons had no formal medical education, the records show that by the Battle of Gettysburg, and that's important, both armies had well-qualified staff serving in their medical corps. The training may have differed from a modern-day medical education, but they were among the best trained physicians at the time. Most had come before medical examining boards to test their knowledge of medicine before receiving a commission. And I have to say that there are a lot of surgeons that I found in 1862 who were no longer there in 1863 because they politely declined to be examined by the medical examining committees and so resigned. So that's why I would say that by Gettysburg, you're really looking at a well-qualified corps of medical personnel. Of those serving at Gettysburg, 92% of Union surgeons and 88% of Confederate surgeons have documentation that they either received an MD degree or took an equivalent 2-year course from a medical college. Those without documented medical college training may have taken courses without graduating, which happened, apprenticed to a physician, which was still a practice at that before the Civil War, studied abroad, which many did, or attended a medical college whose records are no longer available. So because I can't find documentation doesn't mean they weren't educated. This University of Pennsylvania ticket for practical anatomy and a later photograph of a dissection class document the importance of practical training in addition to the lectures and readings. John Billings, a U.S. assistant surgeon, later said about his education that, quote, "What has remained is what I got in the dissecting room and in the clinics." So even though the later surgeons and later doctors would complain that the medical education was not at what it should be and that it was just lectures, actually they were getting a lot of practical training through the dissection and classes and the clinics. Where did they go to school? There were more than 100 medical schools in the U.S. at the outbreak of the war. 2 Philadelphia schools, the University of Pennsylvania and Jefferson Medical College, together stand out as having the most attendees, with 1/3 of all Gettysburg surgeons. 1/3 of all Gettysburg surgeons went to one of those 2 schools, and that's both Union and Confederate. New York University had 61 attendees divided between Confederate and Union surgeons, and among Southern schools, the University of Virginia and Virginia Medical College together had 24 Confederate attendees, and 6 other Southern schools had more than 10 attendees each. It's significant that the Medical College of Virginia here in Richmond was the only Southern medical school that continued classes during the war. All the others shut down for the duration of the war, partly because the professors and students joined and went off to war. While Northern medical schools continued to graduate new doctors, the supply of Confederate surgeons was much more limited as the war went on. In addition to so-called regular medical colleges, a handful of surgeons were students of homeopathic colleges in Cleveland, Philadelphia, and St. Louis, or eclectic colleges located in New York, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and Ohio. 3 graduated from the Hydropathic Hygiotherapeutic College of New York, which was about water therapy. Many had studied in Europe and in the universities there, Paris and Germany. Some have even had previous military experience from either the Mexican War and also in the European conflicts of the mid-19th century, including Crimea. So the idea that that no one in the medical corps had military experience is not true either. Why they joined? I assumed that they joined for political and patriotic reasons, but I found that surgeons who joined the Union and Confederate armies had a wider variety of reasons. For some, it was patriotism, belief in their cause, or a sense of manly duty and honor. So from left to right, I'll start with Daniel Holt, who was assistant surgeon for the 121st New York. He had strong feelings for the Union cause. In April 20th, 1863, he wrote, "How can we as a nation expect the smile of heaven when we hold in bondage, sell and chastise our fellow man for the simple reason that the color of his skin is not like our own, though created by the same hand and sustained by the same power? We never shall succeed until we let the oppressed go free." So he had strong feelings about abolishing slavery. Next to him is Charles S. Bigelow Morton, surgeon of 57th North Carolina in Hoke's Brigade, who actually changed his name from Bigelow his father's Vermont family name and took his mother's Southern name when he joined a Confederate regiment in April 1861. So you get a sense of his strong feelings about political issues. U.S. and Confederate pay of $165 a month for a surgeon or $110 a month for an assistant surgeon was an incentive for some physicians to seek commissions. For many, it was more than they could earn as a small-town doctor starting out in practice. William Child of Bath, Maine, was assistant surgeon of the 5th New Hampshire, was one of many young doctors who found military pay more reliable than private practice. He references the $200 bounty he hopes to receive for enlisting and regularly sends money home to his wife. Although he wishes he were home, he admits that he is getting good pay. In December 1862, he wrote home that he is expecting to be paid at the end of the month and hopes to receive back pay owed him. Quote, "It would pay all our debts and more, but be patient. It will come by and by. I want to pay my debts." For others, it was a chance to expand their medical knowledge and acquire surgical experience on the battlefield. Canadian medical students, in particular, were actively recruited into the Union Army. Francis Wafer, a student of Queen's College, Canada, enlisted as assistant surgeon of the 108th New York, encouraged by recruiters in Kingston, who offered him the opportunity in the spring of 1863 to hone his surgical skills in the U.S. Army between medical sessions. He ended up staying until the end of the war and was one of the many medical students who interrupted his studies in order to serve. What they did after the war surprised me. I expected that Civil War surgeons would contribute to new breakthroughs in medical science, but their post-war experiences were much more diverse than I expected. Some returned to their communities as local doctors. Others became prominent in hospital administration, having learned about hospitals in their military service. Many were involved in medical education and public health. But others left medicine completely to pursue careers in business, finance, and politics. Some became scientists in newly emerging areas of botany, chemistry, and natural history. Above all, Civil War surgeons learned an important lesson from their military experience, and that was that the health of a community, the regiment, the brigade, the division, the army, was just as important as individual health of a single patient. It is not surprising that they became prominent in their home communities as founders of local and state departments of health, advocating for clean water, pure foods, and vaccinations. Some became pioneers in industrial medicine, serving as company doctors for mines, factories, and railroads, tasked with keeping the workforce healthy and able-bodied. And this would have been very much the same as they had done in the Army, which was to keep the regiment healthy and able-bodied and ready for service. The medical reports that they had to keep in the Army, which they all complained about, taught them the importance of medical data. As public health officials and coroners, they went on to track disease and mortality statistics that have led to much better outcomes in disease prevention. So here are a few of examples of post-war medical careers. John Moore Hayes, surgeon of the 29th Alabama, worked as a company doctor at the Pratt Coal Mines in Birmingham, Alabama. He was hired by the state to take care of the imprisoned African Americans who provided labor in what has been called slavery by another name. This is a view behind him of the prison camp at Pratt Mines, and the infirmary is that little building all the way in the back. Assistant surgeon William F. Brakey of the 16th Michigan was one who went on to teach and taught various subjects at the University of Michigan Medical School, and he's pictured here in a surgical class. John Shaw Billings, who I mentioned earlier, was assistant surgeon of the 7th Regiment U.S. Volunteers, and he remained in the Army after the war. The Army Medical Corps had played a major role in public health efforts at quarantine hospitals and sanitary studies, and Billings contributed to this study that's shown here of the 1872 cholera epidemic. His accomplishments included work on the Army Medical Library, tabulating health statistics in the federal census. If any of you have done census work, you know that like around 1900, 1910, they start looking at medical and health issues. And he ended his career as the director of the New York Public Library after retirement in the Army. Many people only know him for that. Another surprise was that so many surgeons were held as prisoners in the months following Gettysburg. As non-combatants, surgeons and assistant surgeons were left behind regularly after battles with their wounded, but they expected to be exchanged, which would be following the accepted rules of war. By my count, 68 surgeons, Confederate surgeons, were left behind in the hospitals of Gettysburg with their wounded, and an additional 20 were captured during the retreat with the ambulance trains or left with wounded at wayside hospitals. Interestingly, only 2 Union surgeons were taken prisoner and remained prisoners after Gettysburg, but they were among and joined some 100 or so Union surgeons that were being held at Libby Prison here in Richmond. About 100 Confederate surgeons were held at Fort McHenry, and all of these surgeons, Confederate and Union, were still awaiting exchange in November as hostages for a West Virginia doctor arrested and accused of treason by Virginia authorities. The specifics of their imprisonment and eventual release provide important insights into the often confusing status of surgeons who were taken prisoner during the Civil War, and later described by S. Ware Mitchell as, quote, an irregular business, to say the least. Perhaps the most important lesson I learned is that care of the wounded was another kind of battle. I started out thinking about the aftermath of the battle as one single narrative of horrific suffering, amputations, dead and dying everywhere, and it's often portrayed that way. But anyone studying a battle knows how important sequence and accurate timing can be to fully understand the flow of the encounter. Following the individual surgeons through the battle and its aftermath has helped me to put together a more accurate timeline for the care of the wounded. I came to understand how care of the wounded differed from week to week and even day by day. Caretakers, locations, and responsibilities changed constantly. So just going quickly through, July 1st to 3rd is the battle. What's going on? The assistant surgeons and most of the regimental surgeons are following their troops and setting up field stations, and other hospitals further back are being set up to take in the wounded. July 4th to 6th, after the retreat of the Confederates, was the work of burials and surgeries continued. From July 6th to 7th, the Union Army departed, the railroads were repaired, and the wounded who could be moved began to be transported out to hospitals in Philadelphia, Baltimore, Washington, and New York, and supplies and volunteers were able to be brought in. From July 7th to 18th, the Union Corps hospitals, remained under the jurisdiction of the Army of the Potomac and Medical Director Jonathan Letterman. And I have to say that the Confederate surgeons who were left behind also remained with their Corps hospitals for quite a while. After that, after the July 18th, the director of the Department of the Susquehanna, William S. King, took charge, and most of the regimental surgeons were gradually replaced by contract surgeons. With the opening of Camp Letterman, July 22nd, the Corps hospitals, both Union and Confederate, were closed, and by mid-August, almost all the Army of the Potomac medical officers were relieved, except for 4 surgeons and 4 assistant surgeons, with contract surgeons replacing them. 9 Confederate surgeons remained at Camp Letterman until October 22nd. And for Letterman, it remained as the General Hospital at Gettysburg, which during that period of time, it's both a general hospital and it's a prison hospital because almost half, at least half the patients were Confederate wounded. The last patients left around November 17th, just before the dedication of the National Cemetery and the famous Gettysburg Address. The database has helped me look at the work of the Gettysburg Surgeons as a group, but it has also allowed me to learn more about them as individuals. So today I'd like to share with you what I learned from digging deeper into the lives of a few surgeons with Virginia connections. Oops. Here we go. I want to start with William Taylor, assistant surgeon of the 19th Virginia. And I have to say that he may be my very favorite surgeon and the one I would most like to have met. And I think you'll understand why as I describe him to you. William Taylor was born in Richmond, graduated from the Medical College of Virginia in 1856, and practiced medicine until the Civil War. He served as an assistant surgeon throughout the war, even though he was promoted to surgeon because he preferred to stay with the men. And you'll see that he's always the contrarian. In a lively account of his experiences as a Confederate assistant surgeon presented to the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Philadelphia in 1906, his wry humor and skill as a raconteur comes through on the printed pages. He is often quoted to describe the state of Civil War medicine. And so here's an example. He explained that, quote, he gained an excellent knowledge of the art of practicing medicine without medicines and surgery without surgical appliances. He also described that at sick call, quote, all complainants were asked the same question, how are your bowels? If they were open, I administered a plug of opium. If they were shut, I gave a plug of blue mass. And these comments still elicit a laugh. Should we take these descriptions literally at face value? Perhaps not. By his own admission at the end of the talk, he admits he has presented it in light words and trivial form. If you read his entire address and other writings, you soon recognize his wry humor and self-deprecating style. There we go. Other published works include a travel log of his trip to Europe with a friend suffering from tuberculosis that was published soon after the war. His descriptions are vivid and unsparing in their detail, but amusing to read even now. Note the caricature of himself he chose as the frontispiece. A later collection of his various lectures includes a longer version of his experiences as an assistant surgeon, as well as wide-ranging lectures on education, suicide, and the existence of the soul. He got into some trouble in Richmond on that one on the existence of the soul. They are all written in a conversational and engaging style that is unusual for 19th century writers. He was a favorite of Richmond newspapermen for his quotable quips. One newspaper writer described, quote, his bright, droll way that was sharp and interesting, both in subject matter and in way of saying it. And he often joked about being a dead man's doctor. His self-deprecating humor should not be taken as lack of erudition. Taylor was a serious scientist. He was state chemist for Virginia and the official chemist for the State Department of Agriculture for Virginia. He was a member of the Richmond Board of Health, and from 1872 until his death was the coroner of the city. He taught chemistry, toxicology, and medical jurisprudence in the Medical College of Virginia, and when the Richmond High School opened, Dr. Taylor was chosen as teacher of physics and chemistry for 28 years. He published on subjects of chemistry, physics, and medical jurisprudence. I hope others will dig deeper to bring out his contributions to light. And I think in particular, his 40 years of coroner's reports would make some interesting reading. I think this could be the beginning of CSI Richmond, 19th century. In one newspaper account, it said that he had already completed 4,000 cases, so plenty of material. He was often cited as an expert witness on poisonings. As a chemist, it was one of his specialties, sometimes convicting and other times exonerating suspects based on scientific evidence. This drawing, published in the local newspaper, was used as evidence to show the trajectory of a bullet and solve a murder trial. Dr. Taylor never married. He was described as a confirmed bachelor who often expressed his distaste for women's bodies. He dedicated De Quibus, the book that I showed earlier on his lectures, to his students, and, quote, whose friendship has brightened my life. And here he's pictured from a newspaper account in his role as a teacher, clearly one of the important parts of his life. Hunter Holmes McGuire is perhaps best known in Civil War circles as Stonewall Jackson's surgeon, the recorder of his last words, and author of a biography of the general. But there's much more to his story. The son of a prominent physician, McGuire graduated from Winchester Medical College in 1855 and later continued his medical studies in Philadelphia at both the University of Pennsylvania and Jefferson Medical College, where he held private classes in operative surgery until John Brown's raid in 1859. At that point, fearing that Southerners might be attacked in Philadelphia, he personally led an exodus of over 300 Southern medical students attending school in Philadelphia, many of whom then completed their medical studies at the Medical College of Virginia that offered to allow them to complete their studies without charge. He was teaching in the medical college in New Orleans at the outbreak of the war, but returned home to join the Confederate cause. He quickly moved up the ranks to become a medical director. Unlike Taylor, who wanted to stay in the regiment. McGuire is also known as an advocate for treating medical personnel as non-combatants, and this comes back to this subject of doctors as prisoners. In 1862, as Stonewall Jackson's medical director, he helped establish the so-called Winchester Accords that provided for the unconditional release of surgeons left in the hands of the enemy to care for their wounded after battles. At Gettysburg, serving as Ewell's medical director, he amputated General Trimble's leg, but he was probably also influential in working with senior First Corps medical officers, Thomas Houston Bache and John Theodore Hurd, to allow Union surgeons to continue to operate and treat wounded in hospitals in town throughout the battle. It also might be why there were not a lot of surgeons who were prisoners in town for the days of the battle that were taken as prisoners. There are several images of Hurd, but none of Bache, and this is an image titled Surgeon Hurd and His Staff, but it may include both of them. After the war, Dr. McGuire practiced in Richmond and became closely associated with the Medical College of Virginia. He became professor of surgery in 1865. He was one of the first surgeons to practice Listerism, adopting the germ theory of infection quite early. Despite a busy private practice, he was reported as willing to treat charity cases and to treat Confederate soldiers without charge. He served as president of the American Surgical Association, Southern Surgical Association, and American Medical Association. In 1881, he resigned his position at the medical college following a fight with the Board of Trustees. He was clearly a man with his own opinions. After his resignation, he founded St. Luke's Hospital, and in 1892, his interest in teaching led him to help found a new medical school, the University College of Medicine, that extended the curriculum to 3 years. And again, many of the surgeons who had served in the Civil War really became advocates for improving and enlarging the educational possibilities for medical students. And so this is one example of that. Later, these various medical schools merged as Virginia Commonwealth University Medical School. Samuel Brown Morrison, also served in Ewell's Second Corps and as the chief surgeon of Early's division, so he was at the division level. Except for medical school and the years of the Civil War, Morrison spent most of his life in and around Rockbridge County, Virginia. Born near Brownsburg, he attended Washington College in Lexington, the county seat, graduated from the University of Virginia Medical College in Charlottesville. Before the war, he practiced medicine in Lexington. During the war, he served as surgeon of the 58th Virginia before being appointed chief surgeon of General Ewell's division in 1862. 2 weeks later, he amputated Ewell's leg and continued as division surgeon under General Jubal Early in Ewell's Second Corps. Morrison also had a connection with General Stonewall Jackson and was related to him through Jackson's second wife, Mary Anna Morrison. Called to the mortally wounded Jackson's bedside in May 1863, Jackson reportedly remarked, "That's an old familiar face," when he saw Morrison. At Gettysburg, he helped set up the division hospitals along Harrisburg Road, including at the Benner Farm. Here in the collection of the Virginia Historical Society, several letters home to his wife reveal Morrison's feelings following the Battle of Gettysburg. This is a wedding photograph marking his 1854 marriage to Mary Elizabeth Gold, the daughter of the local doctor from Brownsburg, and one would suspect that he may have studied with his wife's father, and it was not uncommon for young doctors to marry the daughters of their preceptors. On August 5th, 1863, he wrote home to his wife. This is just after the Battle of Gettysburg. "I saw the dead scattered over the field. The thought of being killed in battle and being buried as I have seen many a soldier, buried in a heap on the battlefield, I have no fancy for such a death and burial. When I die, I would wish to be buried where my dust might mingle with yours and be near those who were dear to me on earth." I have to say that this is an unusual letter. Very few of the surgeons that I've found really talk a lot about death at the time. It's such an everyday occurrence to them that his taking time to think about his own death and to relate to it is actually out of character and unusual. Morrison got his wish. He returned home after the war, served in the state legislature from 1871 to 72, again a political career, and then became the proprietor of the Rockbridge Baths from 1874 until his death in 1901. The baths offered the healing properties of mineral waters containing lithium and magnesium, which were popular medical treatments associated with 19th century hydropathic medicine, and claimed to offer relief for rheumatism and complaints of kidney and bladder, among a long list of other ailments. Prominent members of Virginia society, including Robert E. Lee, probably visited this hotel. Morrison is buried next to his wife in the New Providence Presbyterian Cemetery in Raffine, Rockbridge County, so he got his wish. John Boursicoe Fontaine was born at Beaver Dam in Hanover County, Virginia, the seventh of 11 children. His father, Edmund Fontaine, inherited the family plantation and was also prominent in Virginia politics and the development of the railroads in Virginia. The family was descended from French Huguenots who had escaped persecution after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1683, first fled to England and Ireland, and finally settled in Virginia. Dr. Fontaine studied medicine in Richmond at New York University and received his medical degree from the Medical College of Virginia in 1860. I don't know for sure, but he may have been one of those that left Philadelphia and New York after John Brown raid. In 1861, he offered his services to the Confederacy and served with the 4th Virginia Cavalry. By November 1862, he became brigade surgeon to General Fitzhugh Lee. He was able, in January of 1863, to take off time to marry Elizabeth Winston Price, but was right back on duty by March 2nd. At Kelly's Ford, at March 17, 1863, his horse was shot out from under him. Records at the National Archives include his request for his request for compensation of $175 for the assessed value of the horse. And these documents may well have been penned on the field desk shown here, which was recently added to the collection of the National Museum of Civil War Medicine in Frederick, Maryland. And it definitely shows wear and tear from its use in the field. This would be the kind of desk that a surgeon would take with him and where they filled out all those reports that they had to make. One account mentions him at Gettysburg. Sergeant Oscar St. John, Company F of the 17th Connecticut, was captured on the first day. And an account says that he was taken prisoner on the street that runs from the square to Cemetery Hill and paroled on the field. Dr. Fontaine used one of the houses on the square for a hospital, and St. John was there helping for 3 days, and on the morning of the 4th, joined the regiment and reported for duty. So that's one of the ways that you can kind of put together from very odd accounts whether someone was there or not, but this is interesting documentation. After Gettysburg, Fontaine took on additional responsibilities as medical director of Jeb Stuart's Cavalry Division and attended the general when he was mortally wounded and died on May 12, 1864. In summer of 1864, he became medical director of the Cavalry Corps, but was killed in action in the fall on October 1st, 1864, near Petersburg. We have an eyewitness to the event who wrote to Mrs. Fontaine on October 6, 1864, 5 days after the battle. And he says, quote, "It was about 4 o'clock when the battle was joined up and began furiously. In about 10 minutes, a courier dashed up to General Hampton and informed him that General Dunavant, commanding a South Carolina brigade, was mortally wounded. As soon as the announcement was made, Dr. Fontaine put spurs to his horse and, calling to his courier Pattison to follow, dashed at a gallop in the direction of General D. He passed one of our batteries, which was in full play and being replied to by the guns of the enemy. When about 20 paces in front of the battery, a shell from the enemy's gun exploded about 30 paces in his immediate front, a piece of which, a very small fragment, struck him upon the chin and, glancing downward, entered the left side of his throat near the socket. One of us galloped on and found a house about a quarter-mile distance. Dr. Gilliam took position by his side and watched the developments of his case with a tenderness and sympathy that was truly affecting. It was soon ascertained that the doctor was suffering from an internal hemorrhage and that his case was hopeless. No relief could be afforded him. It made our duty so much more painful and melancholy that we could not aid him or assuage his suffering." Fontaine was only 24 years old. He is buried in the family cemetery at Beaver's Dam, along with his older brother Edmund Jr., who also died at the age of 24, 2 years earlier at Manassas. His brother's headstone reads, "Son of Edward and Maria Louisa Fontaine, who fell on the 21st July, 1861, in his 24th year, bravely defending the liberties of country at the first Battle of Manassas, where forces of the Confederate States were blessed with a glorious victory over the invading Army of the North." The even longer inscription on Dr. John Fontaine's tombstone expresses his family's grief in darker tones of loss and resignation 2 years later. It's hard to read and amazing that this was actually engraved on a tombstone, such a long inscription. Died on the battlefield near Petersburg, Virginia, on the first day of October in his 24th year. A graduate of medicine in 1860, he entered the Confederate service in April 1861, 20 years old, and reached the highest position in his department. He had been spared through the dangers of many a skirmish when he rode in the ranks with Stuart and Hampton, and at last was mortally wounded while rendering professional aid to a dying general. Brave, true-hearted, Christian boy falling in the discharge of duty. Let us not mourn for thee, but admitting to the will of God say, the Lord gives and the Lord hath taken away. And the loss for that family was obviously very deep. Oops. People sometimes ask where I get information about the surgeons, and my short answer is everywhere. Letters, diaries, newspapers, reports, patient cases, military records. One of the most satisfying things about this project has been fitting odd pieces of information that fit together in surprising ways. Sometimes they raise new questions or help answer others. But brought together, they help complete that bigger picture of Civil War medicine history through the lives of the individual surgeons. One example is Benjamin Franklin Ward, surgeon of the 11th Mississippi. Contemporary newspapers often reported on appointments, battles, wounded, and prisoners. So on the right is a clipping from the Baltimore Sun, July 25th, 1863. And here's what it says. A party of surgeons and chaplains attached to the Confederate Army who remained on the battlefield after the Battle of Gettysburg to attend to the wounded arrived in New York on Thursday morning last. General Canby made arrangements for their return south via Fortress Monroe, they being non-combatants. The following are their names. And there, the first name is B.F. Ward, 11th Mississippi. On July 25th, it's interesting that the expectation was that they still would be returned south. In the middle are the service records for Benjamin Franklin Ward, surgeon of the 11th Mississippi, in the National Archives that show his transfer to New York, then Fortress Monroe, then Fort Norfolk, and then back to Baltimore and Fort McHenry, where he remained until the exchange of all the surgeons in November. Sometimes we're lucky enough to find personal accounts written by the surgeons themselves. Dr. Ward published an article in the Confederate Veteran, Volume 21, November 1913, that describes his experiences at Gettysburg. And he goes into quite detail about who else was there and how many wounded there were. But he says, when Lee was preparing to retire, General Heth sent me a written order to remain there as surgeon-in-chief of all his wounded left on the field, 690 in number. And I want to point out here, a lot of times people say, oh, and reports of people, of surgeons will say, you know, he valiantly volunteered to remain with the wounded. Well, it turns out they actually received orders who would remain and who would go. It is the Army, after all. I wish I had time to talk about all 1,200 surgeons, but for others, I'll let you read the book to learn more about what happened to them at Gettysburg, what they did after the war, and finally, after experiencing death on a monumental scale during the war, how they faced their own mortality. I hope you'll enjoy meeting and getting to know these Gettysburg surgeons as much as I have. I think Dr. James would be glad to see them recognized finally. And I'll end with a quote from Dr. S. Weir Mitchell that I think serves as a fitting epitaph for every Gettysburg surgeon. He fired no shot, but was often forced to operate under fire. Thank you. I have left, I hope, enough time for some questions, and I'm happy to answer any that you might have.
Ma'am, I'm aware that after the battle, the Union Army required a lot of their surgeons and assistant surgeons to rejoin the Army, and that's when all these contract surgeons. But I was curious as to how they were hired, because they came from different places in the North, and I wonder if you have any sense of that.
I do. I've discovered that even though the contract surgeons have remained somewhat of a mystery, once you know their names, you can go to the National Archives, and they do have records as military records with the other surgeons. So I've actually been able to find some of the contracts. So many of them were already contracted and working in the hospitals in Washington, Baltimore, and Philadelphia. So those were the main places that they came from. But one of the surgeons, one of the contract surgeons who remained at Camp Letterman, in his file in the National Archives is a handwritten contract signed by Jonathan Letterman, and then a later letter from Letterman saying that in his haste he had to sign it in pencil, no pen being at hand. And this was a contract surgeon who was in Frederick, probably still left over from the hospitals of Antietam. Letterman must have met him on his way following the Confederate Army and said, "Go back to Gettysburg. You know, here's a contract to go back." So some of it was on the fly. Some of it was well documented and experienced contract surgeons who had been working in hospitals.
Is there any record of women surgeons during the Civil War?
Yes. So the only woman known, it was Mary Edwards Walker, who refused. She had graduated from a medical college. She also then attended courses at the Hydropathic Institute in New York. She refused to work as a nurse and insisted on being treated as a contract surgeon or a volunteer. So for most of the war, she was a volunteer because they would not hire her. She finally did get a commission as a contract surgeon. But she was definitely at Gettysburg as a volunteer at the time. But she continued to make sure that she would not identify herself as a nurse. There were quite a few nurses, women who were employed as nurses during the Civil War who had medical degrees. But they did not try to serve as surgeons.
I'm curious as to whether there was any collaboration or cooperation between the surgeons on both sides during the war. They probably knew each other. This was brand new to them, and everything was emergency. Was there any? Can you speak to that, please?
Yes, they definitely did. One of the things that when I started this project is like, okay, do I need to do two separate groups? And then it became clear, this is one group of people, this is one profession that are on a battlefield. They may be representing different sides of the different armies, but their work is very similar, and they do interact quite a bit. There's one account of a surgeon who sent after the battle from Washington, and he describes how he saw a group of Confederate surgeons operating, and he recognized one of them as his student because he was using the technique that he had taught him in Philadelphia. And he then goes and meets him, and they introduce, and there's like a little reunion of this former professor and student. So they knew each other from medical school. They learned from each other. I mentioned that the number of people, young people that joined the medical corps for medical training to increase their understanding of surgery in particular. But throughout the war, surgeons are learning from each other. So you have this accumulation. I mean, there's a lot of surgeons at Gettysburg, and they're coming from different medical schools, different training, different ages, and they actually would keep doing courses with each other. And at the beginning, that picture of Letterman that shows the operation and all those people around him, it's not that they're gawking at a surgery. This is like a medical school class for the older surgeons teaching the younger surgeons. And even when they're in, I have several diaries from, one diary from the Union surgeons that were at Libby Prison, and he talks about the fact that they were doing little classes and talking about surgery with each other. So they never stopped training, and that was cross when they were prisoners and working after a battle. They continued to interact. And as I said, there were 9 surgeons that stayed at Camp Letterman, and one of them was put in charge of one of the wards. So they're treated as colleagues.
At the beginning of the war, did the armies advertise for doctors, or how did they build up the staff?
At the beginning of the war, and one of the problems was that as they raised regiments, both in the North and the South, the colonel is kind of putting together his team. And oftentimes a local doctor would be recruited to go with the regiment. And so to begin with, there was not a lot of oversight in terms of who was chosen. And that's what I'm saying is, I mentioned before, that in the course of the war, they are constantly trying to refine that group of doctors and have them better and better qualified. So a lot of some of the surgeons that start at the beginning don't continue, and they're replaced often by younger and more recently educated doctors. But I don't know that there was a call for it. I've never seen an advertisement for it, but there were enough perks, I think, for joining that they had enough applicants.
By 1865, there was hardly any anesthesia left in the Confederate Army doing surgery. Did you find any reports on, at the beginning, 63 at Gettysburg, they had anesthesia. By 65, they didn't have.
I haven't found any real documented accounts of anyone doing surgery without anesthesia during the war. The danger of operating without anesthesia was so great that that was not a given. I think there was more anesthesia than. As far as I know, I've never heard anyone, from the medical side, say that this was done without anesthesia. It's kind of folklore to some extent. Obviously, by the end of the war, the Confederacy, because of the blockades, et cetera, was running low on supplies. They were also running low on doctors. So, as I mentioned, they were not putting out graduating new doctors in the southern schools, except for here in Richmond. And it's interesting because I did a search, and the percentage of doctors who were at Confederate surgeons at Gettysburg who were still surgeons at Appomattox is really amazing. That is not true for the Union. For the Union, they often would serve their 3-year term or whatever it was. When the regiment mustered out, they would muster out as well, sometimes becoming contract surgeons or re-enlisting. But clearly, there was no one to replace many of those surgeons, so they stayed until Appomattox.
And that's all we're going to have time for in terms of questions and answers in the forum, but just as a reminder, Barbara Franco's book is going to be available in the gift shop, and she's also going to be available in Commonwealth Hall to sign copies of the book and answer any other questions that you might have. So let's give Barbara another round of applause for a fantastic lecture, and thank you everyone for your support.